Good evening. Thank you all for coming out on this rainy, blustery evening. I'm Richard Sommer, the Dean of the John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design, and I would like to welcome you to tonight's discussion on the architecture of the image. This evening's discussion is part of the Daniels Fora series, which is now in its 5th year. I'll get some light here. Since its inception, the goal of the Fora series has been to bring together a diverse set of practitioners and scholars to discuss issues of vital interest to those of us that believe that understanding and creating better relationships between architecture, art, landscape, and cities is essential to contemporary society. Past events in this series have included an exploration of what might be a Toronto aesthetic as captured and cultivated by filmmakers, architects, and writers, featuring filmmaker Adam Egoyan, architect and professor John Schneer, and author and academic Amy Lavender Harris. Another fora was a very critical look at the influence of Jane Jacobs' work and her concept of the city and its relevance to today, featuring the scholars Margaret Crawford and Timothy Minnell. A third, and these are just a sampling, was a debate on the benefits of urban intensification and what we usually mean when we use, what we might actually mean when we use the term suburban sprawl, and that was with the urban designer Vishaan Chakrabarty and the historian Robert Brugman. So as you can see, many of the previous events in this series concentrated on urbanization and the building arts. But as some of you may know, a little over a year ago, the Daniels faculty captured, I'm not sure this is the right word, or maybe the better word is incorporated, all of the visual studies programs at University of Toronto's main campus. Our idea in consolidating University of Toronto's programs in visual studies, architecture, landscape architecture, and urban design at the Daniels faculty is to broaden and deepen the experience of students and faculty and our many partners in these allied disciplines. Our bigger, not so secret agenda is to make sure that the building arts, design, and visually based thinking at the University of Toronto is an important focus for education and research, and to put our modes of scholarship and practice on par with the writing and mathematics-based ways of seeing the world that have actually dominated at great research universities like the University of Toronto and others. So I hope most of you have noticed, and if you haven't, take a look, that the construction on the Daniels faculty's new home at 1 Spadina is now underway. Soon, demolition of some of the older portions will begin, and you'll start to see the new piece come up. And one of the goals of this project in relation to the dynamic I'm describing is to create a physical space, a district, if you will, at the intersection of Toronto and the university where architecture, urbanism, and the arts can flourish. So our visual studies program includes studio-based art and a graduate program in curatorial studies. So with these kinds of events, we want to start to highlight these things, and to this end, tonight's discussion builds out on the forum we presented last year entitled Material Evidence. This event brought together New York Times columnists and the paper's former visual editor, Charles Blow, with the University of Toronto's leading academic on data in global cities, Patricia McCarney, and the media artist, Ben Rubin. And together they discussed and debated the potential that visual representations of data have to improve civic engagement and to make better sense of the world in which we live. Tonight's discussion is an opportunity to highlight our faculty's expanding horizons. We have an incredible panel with us here tonight, and I'm very pleased to welcome Richard Barnes, a New York-based photographer, and Charles Stankievech, our newly appointed visual studies professor and an artist with a global practice, and Stephanie Smith, the AGO's recently appointed chief curator, to the stage, and you'll see them to my left. Now, to save time, and because my staff gets very nervous when I start to wax on about our guests, which I tend to do, we've included their bios in the program you received upon entering the theater. So, in terms of introducing the guests, I only say that one of the selfish pleasures I have in assembling these events is bringing together people who have never met, and sometimes I have never met, but who I am sure have a critical interest in common and can be brought out in interesting ways in a public setting like this. So in this case, I've admired and been aware of Richard Barnes's work for more than 20 years. Charles Stankievech, we were lucky to lure to the faculty last year, so I've only really had less than a year to understand his work. And Stephanie Smith, the AGO's new curator, her work I've only been able to admire, her work in curating at various interesting museums, I've only really been able to admire from afar. So before getting started and giving a very, very short additional introduction, I'd like to take a moment to thank our friends at Herman Miller, who have once again provided the furnishings here on stage for our discussion. We appreciate the opportunity to showcase Herman Miller's award-winning designs and continue to be thankful for its partnership with us on this Fora series. And I'm especially thankful tonight that the chairs don't have rollers on them, because if you were at the last Fora, I got very animated and I started like rolling around the stage, and people said afterwards that they asked if I was okay, but I was okay. I was just excited about the event. So now, on with the program. In a minute or two, I'm going to turn the podium over first to Charles Stankievech and then to Richard Barnes, who will give their presentations on their work. After these presentations, Stephanie and I will have some questions, and we'll enter into a discussion about the work, which we hope will be thought-provoking. So I want to make my introduction as simple as possible. When speaking to students and others about the fields of art, architecture, and design, I like to argue that making a great work of art or architecture, or many other work in many other media, allied media, this work has to start with an act of looking and seeing. It's as much about finding the world as it is of figuring a way to represent or figure the world. Last week, we had the great landscape architect Cornelia Oberlander at our faculty over at 230 College. She came to a short visiting residency and chair. She gave a lecture and met with our students. I don't think she would mind me telling you that she is 93 years old and still deeply engaged in practice, including fairly intense site field work, sometimes in the north and sometimes in very far-flung places. She and I shared our encounters with another great landscape architect, the late Dan Kiley, and she told me that when she worked for Dan Kiley in rural Vermont in the 1950s, she had these very interesting experiences because she lived at his house. One day at breakfast, Kiley said to Oberlander, in a rather kind of existential or ambiguous way, he said to her, "Go and see the forest and step lightly." And then she said he said nothing else. So she said that it took her a long time to understand what he meant, but how she eventually came to know how important it was to look very slowly and very carefully at the places and things you might hope to capture through your art, and in her case, transform through your designs. So I have to wonder what the status of this way of looking might be today in an age, for example, of social media that has made the use of images to record our lives, curate our identities, and bear witness to events from around the world ubiquitous and often instant. Children, actually my own children and their friends, now use applications such as Instagram to communicate with each other. That is, they use a medium that is primarily image-based and not text-based to tell each other where they are and think about what they're doing. So I think this is really a new sensibility, and maybe we will and maybe we won't discuss that tonight, but I think it is a context for understanding the architecture of the image today. But first and most importantly, we will hear from two individuals who take the art of finding and forming images to a very high level of intensity. Individuals who engage in incredible field work to shine a light on phenomena that would otherwise be unknown or unseen. Both Richard Barnes and Charles Stankievech understand how to use the communicative power of images to tell novel stories. So you're about to see how their work raises what I believe are critical questions about our relationship to history, geography, and the natural world, among other things. And in so doing, how these people test our understanding about what is real and what is artificial. So with that, I want to call Charles to the stage and get the event going. Thank you all for coming. So Charles.
Thank you, Richard, for the lovely introduction. Also, just quick thank you to my new colleagues at the university. It's really exciting to be in the city and at such a high caliber of an institution, both in the visual studies and the architecture program. It's kind of been off to the races already this fall. So I look forward to continuing the conversation this evening, but also kind of for the next few years, at least, hopefully. Also it's been great to move to Toronto. The community here has been really amazing. I just want to say that at this moment too. So it's with that I kind of launch into some work that has both been shown in the city and also is about to be shown in the new year. So there's a little sneak peek tonight. I wanted to start with this image at first, which is kind of a modus operandus for me, particularly a certain phrase in it. This book here is a World War II basic training manual. It's my grandfather's manual that was given to me as an inheritance. And it has one passage within the part about camouflage. It has a list of do's and don'ts of camouflage. And that one phrase that pops out is this one here. Do keep in the shadow, and remember that the shadow moves. And this line for me came out very poetically. I've read a lot of old military manuals in my research, and it really struck me in three different ways. One is just obviously the literalness of it, that it comes from a military document, and most of my research for the last 7 years or so has been on military intelligence and military architecture and strategies. So in a way, it's a very literal document. Artifacts are very important for me. In general, this is, for instance, this book was actually shown here at the University of Toronto at the Barnacle Gallery for a show called Counterintelligence this last January and March. And so in a way, it is this very literalness of the content that I work with in an archival matter. But also there's this other two aspects to it, and one is just this metaphorical aspect of the shadow itself. I mean, I look particularly at issues of intelligence, military surveillance, and military architecture or outpost architecture, or these kind of shadow realms of the military that are inaccessible either by geography or by design or then by control through archives and through structures of the institution. So it's this shadow that takes on this kind of metaphorical aspect. The third aspect of this sentence is really kind of, I think, of maybe relevance to this evening and the sense of methodology, in the sense of how, in a way, it's a trick to always figure out when to be invisible and when not to be invisible, and this idea with the documentary of when the artist or the author is present in the work in a voice, and when they kind of go towards the issue of immediacy or neutrality, and when to keep in the shadow and when not to keep in the shadow, or more importantly, through a historical reference that maybe we can get into later from 1906 and the first kind of Congress on photographic issues in Marseille, we can look at how one moves and has to move because the shadow is moving itself. So it's with that kind of introduction that I wanted to specifically talk about, I guess, two projects, but there's one of them split into two different sites. And we'll do a kind of a reverse archaeology in the sense. I'll start with work that's not finished, and this is the sneak peek, but it's historically first. And those three kind of military outposts really look and compare kind of the architecture of invisibility and the invisibility of architecture, kind of that inverse. And what I mean by that is particularly, of course, these remote locations that are hard to get to. This one, you have to swim through a swamp to get to. The other ones, you have to kind of go camping along the coast. And then the third is the most extreme one. It's a military Arctic station that can only access through military transport after 2 days of flying. So it's this idea of architecture that is away from the site. But there's a second aspect to it as well that really looks at architecture that is designed to sense the invisible. These are all early warning systems that we'll be looking at, and in that regard, it's detecting the invisibility of sound and also the invisibility of gravity and the invisibility of the electromagnetic. And so these architectures are designed to kind of function in this realm. And then the third, of course, is how to photograph the invisible. And I was joking, we were talking earlier, I've actually technically never shown a photograph ever. They're always shown within a context of the moving image or installations or some kind of archival installation. But in a way, how does one visualize, or how does one imagine these principles which you can't look at directly, and looking at these architectural characteristics that are invisible? So it's that that we'll start with this image here. This is a sound mirror from World War I, or just a little bit after World War I, should we say, the interwar period. It's a British military experiment that's in Dungeness. It's actually close to Derek Jarman's garden, if anyone has visited that area. And it was invented to be an early warning system for aircraft. Particularly, it was these images, or these buildings / kind of military experiments were facing the English Channel to detect these airplanes coming over. A microphone was built at the focus of these geometries to try to amplify the sound of these. These were a failure, but they were an interesting kind of construction. They existed in several places along the coast. This one kind of still exists a bit today because it's in the middle of an estuary. And like I was saying, there's kind of, you can see the swamp in the foreground that you have to kind of ford and get to. So there's a certain preservation of these sites. The other one, just a couple more images there. So how to photograph these, how to look at these sonic principles. I should say the soundtrack for the film is made by Colin Stetson, a American composer living in Montreal. And this issue of, again, looking at the atmosphere and, of course, the wind and the air moving to kind of visualize this idea of vibrations and flow of energy amongst these kind of ruins. The title, I should say, is The Second Coming, or The Monument is Ruin, for this body of work. So on one side, we have this architecture of sound, and on the other side, and again, creating this kind of curtain or this border. All of these are borders or curtains, frontier outposts, shall we say. Across that channel, of course, here's an image of the channel here, is another architecture that comes a little bit later that I think most people are more familiar with, and these are, of course, the Todd Corporation's bunkers. And so we enter World War II, and we enter kind of the visual. So the first outpost was the sonic, the second is the visual. And in a way, this is following Paul Virilio's observation that bunkers really articulated the last gesture of Occidental warfare. And what this means, of course, is that it's kind of the tradition of two knights on the battlefield, and as they see each other across the landscape through the slits, right, through their armor. The bunker was kind of this last architectural gesture to continue that military strategy. Of course, with intercontinental ballistic missiles or the birth of the V-2 rocket in World War II, the military really takes on a third dimension, and this kind of line or front doesn't make as much sense. But what I particularly wanted to do was is go and photograph bunkers that had fallen off of cliffs. So I particularly hunted these out. And this is kind of my anti-Robert Smithson wood kind of shed buried in a way. And it's said the entropy has taken away the landscape. Instead of burying the architecture has been revealed over time. In a way, there are these mausoleums of monolithic cement that have remained. And I mean, this is my only kind of literal connection maybe to architectural structure, but the building we're in here and all sitting in and all architecture mainly is, of course, built on a foundation, a cement pad, struts, pallades, these types of kind of structures. So if that base is destroyed, the structure on top of it crumbles. Now in these buildings, of course, with the warfare being designed for the landscape to be blown away, all that would happen with the building would kind of rotate. Because in a sense, they are sculpture. They're single cast kind of concrete architecture. Like a sculptural object. So what really happens is their architectural integrity is based on gravity, a center of gravity, so they just rotate and then they can fall and maintain their kind of their shape. Or in the war, they could just shift and still protect whoever's inside and still be operational. So these ones here are just photographs of this. This is part of an installation being built currently with kind of a full-scale 15-foot cement parabolic structure as a speaker sound kind of reflector. Some sculptures. I think I will be putting some photographs actually in the show for the first time. But it's kind of a suite of work that looks at these issues. The videos themselves are shot actually as science fiction films. Here's just a little bit of just for scale, to show someone standing beside the actual building to give you kind of the gravity of what's going on. So I take these images, and it's very important in my work that I go to these sites. This isn't kind of armchair research. It really involves both archival research, but also going to locations, physically accessing them, and documenting them, shall we say, making documents out of them. And so in that regard, I've kind of taken the strategy along with that, because a lot of this work is looking at kind of an absent center or sometimes a historical part that you can't access. I've taken on the genre of the science fiction when I edit the films. So even though all the images are actually shot by myself and the soundtrack is of real, usually landscape kind of field recordings or electromagnetic recordings or radio, I do use the cutting method or the language of science fiction in that regard. And so the last project I'll kind of show, because I know we're kind of supposed to do short presentations today, is the Cineverse ether of the land beyond the land beyond. And this is kind of that third outpost of the trilogy that looks at that topology of military outpost architecture in the 20th century. And in particular, it's the electromagnetic. The work I'm not showing is earlier work. This is all shot in 2011, produced 2013 and now. The obsession with the electromagnetic has been kind of long-standing for me. I've done lots of work on the distant early warning line. Loveland also looked at these issues of military surveillance stations in the Arctic, and really that kind of shift in electromagnetic warfare from World War II into the Cold War, particularly often through Buckminster Fuller's kind of architecture of the geodesic dome, right, as that particular redundancy built into that structure parallel with the intelligence or the electronics that are inside of that, this redundancy network that eventually comes out to be what we call today the internet. So there's a long history of the electromagnetic, and the project that this is continuing was part of a field trip where I went to the most northern settlement in the world, which is CFS Alert, Canadian Forces Station Alert, at the very, very tip of Nunavut, while I was embedded with the Department of Defense. And again, it was this struggle to kind of shoot documentary images, but how to create a language to photograph something that, again, is in darkness, is a classified operation, and you have limited access, even when I have, the most privileged access to get to the site. So I use that kind of genre. So I think I'll just end the presentation by saying that it's normally a 35 millimeter installation. As you can see here, there are other objects that go with it, some clocks that are running out of sync as the exhibition goes along, some records. The soundtrack, I'll just give a quick nod to Glenn Gould. It's the first bar of the aria of the Goldberg Variations, but it's been played through a tape delay and so forth to create kind of a soundtrack that feels like it's been playing for millions of years and the record's stuck in this station while everyone's disappeared. It looks abandoned, and all the journalists or critics write about it as an abandoned military station. I should just say it's definitely not abandoned. It's a fully functional operational CSEC operation that's controlled from Leitrim in Ottawa for military intelligence espionage for the Russians, because the station's closer to Moscow than it is to Ottawa itself. So I'll play that, and then that will be my bit.
Bien. 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 Sí. Devant. Bien. 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 Sí. Devant. Bien.
And that's that. And I should just say that's like a recut trailer. It's not the actual work. I just kind of cut it into about 2 minutes for the presentation this evening. So thank you.
It's a pleasure to reconnect with Richard and also to be in Toronto, one of my favorite cities outside of San Francisco and New York, where I call home. Since we're pressed for time, I'm going to go quickly through these images and give you a little bit of background about my work, because it really starts with this. Most of my work is concerned with history and artifice. I approach the world through a lens of the forensic. It starts from a documentary framework and then moves into other territory. And I'm really interested in exploring places that take me out of my world. My world tends to be, I teach, but I also do editorial work. This is the Unabomber's cabin. As I get older, I have to annotate my discussions because the audiences get younger and nobody knows who this is. And also I'm in Canada and I don't want to assume that you know who this person is, but you all probably do. The Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, was a master mathematician who decided to turn his back on society and went into deep hiding in the woods in Montana. And what he did was he decided, we don't have enough time to go into his life story, so I'm going to make this short. What he did was he terrorized America domestically for 20 years, almost. And by meticulously constructing bombs and sending them out into the world to destroy the people, the institutions that he thought were destroying the earth. So he's our terrorist philosopher. He was caught, his brother turned him in 1999. This work is 15 years old. And his cabin was put on a flatbed truck and shipped out to California. I'm interested in this idea of architecture, and I think that's partially why I'm here today, is because I have a long, strong background, and most of my work deals with architecture in some way or another. So the Unabomber's cabin is shipped out to California to be used as evidence in his trial. The whole idea of a piece of architecture being evidence I find fascinating. And also the fact that it's taken out of context completely. This is where, in Montana, the cabin actually existed for 30 years. The cabin was used by his defense to prove that anybody who could live in a cabin for 30 years without running water or heat had to be insane. Therefore, he would avoid the death penalty. What happened was he pled guilty anyway. This is Ted. This is Mr. Kaczynski, the Unabomber. It's a mugshot. Part of this project, which consists of 6 very large images, was to take the idea of the mugshot and to expand upon it, to look at the cabin isolated as a mugshot in its own right. These are the 4 sides. which I isolated. So there's this thing about the Unabomber which is compelling for me because I was given access. And that's something that we might want to talk about later on, is this idea of access. We did talk about it a bit in the beginning. But for me, having this access, I wouldn't have gotten into this site. I wouldn't have been able to photograph this. But I was able to because I had an institution behind me. Charles has an institution being the Canadian military. It's an interesting place where we're at as working artists. The next project, because we're hurrying along here, is a book that I've done and a body of work called Animal Logic. The image that you saw on the screen before is one of the images of many that were from the Museum of is it Canadian Nature? Richard, Charles? There's a museum in Ottawa, the Canadian Museum of Natural History. And that's right, you're not. What I realized, I was working on archaeological excavations in the 90s. And what I realized was the objects that we were taking out of the ground, I wanted to follow them. I wanted to follow the trajectory of where it was going. So what I did was I created this body of work, primarily in natural history museums, which examines the idea of collection, curation, and display, especially through the diorama. Okay, the idea of the diorama is important to me. The diorama was developed by Louis Daguerre in the 1820s, a photographer, Louis Daguerre, in the 1820s in Paris. I decided that the whole idea of the theatrical nature of dioramas was really interesting. The idea of going out into the natural world and culling animals, killing them, bringing them back, and reanimating them was both perverse and very exciting as an artist to kind of look at and think about. These images are from that series and from that book. They form two chapters, diorama and container. So this idea of the forensic comes through again and again in my work. It's been here 15 years ago, it continues on with this work, and then it goes into the next body of work. This idea of the taking out this display and revealing the structure beneath is sort of the hidden aspect of this, relates back to this Unabomber work. I got access to the vaults in the Smithsonian and started to take off the covers from the crates where the taxidermied animals were kept. And the whole idea of being twice dead really comes through here because not only have these been taken off the floor, but they also are in these containers. Not only have these been culled from nature, but they've been taken off the floor. So they exist in this hidden time. And the last project I want to talk about very briefly is something I'm working on now. Again, I don't know how much of you know about the Civil War. I don't want to talk down to you. This is the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. And I realized early on, after looking at images from the Civil War, that there were no pictures during the battles. There's a very concrete reason why. The technology at the time wouldn't have allowed for people to survive the battle, and therefore there was no way they could do it. There was no embedding back in the Civil War. And that's why you see images of camp life before the battle and dead bodies after the battle. I decided at some point, again, an assignment from National Geographic, not to do this, but to do something completely different, which I took into this realm and made it my own. What I decided was to learn the art, the technique of wet plate collodion, which is also tin type, although tin was never used, excuse me. And so what I did was I went to reenactments. And Civil War reenactments are very big. They make a lot of money in America, and they're right now, because it's the 150th anniversary, more and more people are showing up to celebrate these battles, these scenes. Okay. So this was one of the first ones. I looked at these images and I was just so happy to get an image. And just to go in a little bit about what wet plate is, you coat the plate with a silver and then the plate and with a collodion mixture. Collodion is a binder. And then what happens is while the plate's wet, it has to go in the camera, you have to go out and you have to catch the scene. And the exposures are very long, sometimes up to, well, very long. In our day and age, of the digital age, they're very long. Maybe 5 seconds to 10 seconds to sometimes 20. And so you get a lot of blurring, and that's what I wanted to see. I wanted to show what it would look like, almost like Muybridge photographing the horse with legs came off the race course. I wanted to show what it would look like with the reenactments being played out before me. I also realized that I was doing this, that I really needed to get behind. I needed to show the spectator the spectacle quality of this artificial battle, this artificial war. And so I started to look at that aspect and started to think about, okay, what is this? Why are we doing this? Why do we find ourselves needing to reenact this place and this warlike phenomenon, and who's involved in this, and what's the subculture? And then I started to look even more closely at the artifacts that were associated with. And I think of this as, I walk this very narrow line between nostalgia, because I'm using a medium or a technique of the time, and something else. And when it works, I hope it's that something else. When it doesn't, then it falls off, and I don't show those in shows like this. So what happens with these is they become for me, it's this slippage of time. You get these artifacts from the present day that mix in with the Civil War reenactments, and somehow that slippage of time is really exciting and something that's always been part of my work. If there's a famous photograph from the Civil War, and not that there are photographs that come to mind, there are photographs from World War II that are obviously, people can say, oh yeah, I know that image. This is it. This was done by Alexander Gardner. Alexander Gardner worked for Matthew Brady, broke away. Some of the most interesting photographs during the Civil War were done by Gardner. This is not a real scene. This was staged. Alexander Gardner took this person, Confederate soldier, and from about 40 feet away, they've done this sort of forensic take on what was happening and that day, and moved him into this place, which is called the Devil's Den. And when I teach classes, I teach a class called Subverting the Document, Photography and the Forensic. I want my students to understand that photography was telling lies from the very beginning. And we tend to think about this, not so much today, but we did, as the photograph, as the camera, as a truth-telling mechanism. Well, it isn't, and it wasn't then. And I was excited by that. So what I did was I staged my own version of Gardner's photograph. And I thought, I liked the idea of restaging a stage photograph. And so that's where this work is going now. I don't think, actually looking at this and comparing it, it doesn't look a lot like Gardner's photograph, but enough that people look at it and think, oh, is this that photograph I know from the Civil War? Well, it turns out that I'm not the only one who's restaging photographs. These were found on Wikipedia, and I love it. I think it's great. We're all out there doing the same thing. So what does this say about our culture? Here you have a monument that really wasn't a monument. Here you have a place, a site, a historical site that really did not contain the object that it was supposedly, purportedly to contain. I like that idea. I like that idea of the artificial, and the fact that someone like Gardner would do this is both a travesty and also interesting. He was interested in this idea of artifice way before we were even thinking about it. I have one more of these. Something about that color green shows up again and again, green and orange. So it becomes a monument which has no validity, no verisimilitude in history whatsoever. But it does because it exists as a photographic image done by Gardner. And I'll close on my last image here, which is, while I was at Gettysburg last year, this is the Abe Lincoln look-alike contest. I'll let you pick out which one won. Can you really imagine that these people think they look like Abe Lincoln? Fascinating. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be here on stage, to be here in Toronto, and it's a good gathering of minds, and I'm looking forward to having, getting into some rich conversation together and to continue the conversation out in the city as we move forward. But one of the things that's interesting for me coming into a big civic museum like the Art Gallery of Ontario, coming from Chicago, where I was at a different kind of big institution at the University of Chicago, the little museum that was, part of this massive educational institution. I'm interested in thinking about how institutions can provide different kinds of access or deny access in ways that either support or thwart the creative process. And so that's something we started to talk around a little bit earlier, and it seems to play out in different but related ways. And we were talking about, for instance, the fact that in one way, the kind of natural habitat for the Unabomber pieces, at least those disembodied, beautiful photographs that have the kind of mugshot quality, is the pages of the New York Times Magazine, because that was the commissioning agent for the project, and they're beautiful, artful, powerful pieces, but there's a way that they became art for you at another moment in the life of that project. So if you could start by talking about that a little.
Sure. Again, it was an assignment, and when I went there, when I got the assignment, I thought, wow, this could be interesting. This could be something that I could work with in other ways. So I did have a conception that this could go beyond this journalistic piece. When I walked into that space, and that space was empty, I thought immediately of a gallery space. That was not where the cabin was. I removed the cabin from where it was. I actually cut a hole in the wall, and I moved it over and put it in that space. The access part of it came, this is against all journalistic ethics, so, because I actually took the object and moved it into some other place. The access question is important because, as I told you before, I never would have had access to that object, to the cabin. It happens again and again. I mean, I've never had, that's why I showed this 15 years later, because I've never had that kind of project that's come out of an assignment. I'm always trying to make that happen as I move along. But I think it's really important that we realize that, and we were talking about this earlier, that artists have a certain access just because they're considered non-threatening, whereas journalists don't.
Well, and there was also another, just to stick with this for one more moment, there was also something beautiful about your description of going out into the field, then to see the site that the cabin came from, that was something you felt compelled to do on your own. And that feels to me like almost the moment that it starts to shift in your mind into your art project as opposed to work for hire.
Right. Yeah, I said this to Stephanie earlier, that I suggested to the New York Times Magazine, I said, wow, we should really do a diptych. I knew it was going to be a big spread. We should do a diptych, and I should go back to Montana and photograph the site where it came from. And it was like, whoa, where's that idea coming from? So I decided to take it on for myself, and I did it. And I think that's what makes that diptych really work, is the combination of the image in the warehouse and the image on the site.
Yeah, and then Charles, you had a really different, an experience that was layered in different ways.
Yeah, the institution's always been very important. Originally, with my practice kind of developing, came with developing the Yukon School of Visual Art, and it was very much kind of this symbiotic relationship of starting an institution and pedagogy and how that shapes kind of the art practice as well. But in the particular reference to it was like, how do I navigate that? And this project ends up coming at the end of that, where it's like originally, starting with a philosophy degree and then going in and being kind of interdisciplinary, trying to be like, okay, I'm going to switch disciplines. And then all of a sudden it was like, okay, transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. And about 3 years ago, after started realizing a methodology was happening, it kind of said, oh no, this is actually counterintelligence is what's going on here. There's the role here of the metaphor of the double agent that one needs to kind of embrace when you deal with institutions. Yeah. And in that regard, you're entering kind of one role, under the subterfuge of another role. And that plays out in so many ways, as an instructor, as an embedded artist with the military. And particularly in shooting the last piece where I was embedded as an official kind of artist with Department of Defense, I did a lot. The reason why I chose this location, everyone else went to Afghanistan, that was involved in this program. And I particularly wanted this very unknown place. And they asked me, why do you want to go there? And then they put me in charge of the commander. And I had done a lot of research in military architecture in the Arctic. And they asked me, or I wanted to ask the commander lots of questions. I immediately got back the question that this guy's not an artist. This guy sounds like a journalist, It was like, oh, I need to send him like a photo with me in a beret or something like that and be like, okay, no, let's go back and kind of be that. Because exactly, the artist is non-threatening, but as soon as you switch into the journalism kind of, access, they all of a sudden are put their guard up considerably more. I mean, they went there thinking I was going to make them a hero, in this kind of idea of portraiture in this kind of sense.
Well, I think there's as a kind of follow-up to both of those, there's a way that you can think about the work of journalism as research and truth-telling, and there's a way that that both of your practices show the capacity of art to do the same and to tell different kinds of true stories. I was thinking, also sort of looking at I was thinking about patina, and the kind of the accretion, or at least the perceived accretion of a kind of old feel around the photographs, your Civil War photographs, and around the Arctic film. There's a way that it's kind of shimmers around the edges, so it feels, even though it's real footage, it feels like it's maybe a little science fiction-y. It feels like it's going in another place, but there's something that's true about that as well, just as there's something true about like your staged photographs. They were getting at, or the original Civil War photograph was getting at something that was true about, it was telling a true story about the Civil War. Your pictures tell something true about our current state of being, as do those YouTube photographs, right? Like, or the Google photographs that you captured. There's something that they're saying about the state of tourism right now, or a certain sort of disassociated relationship to American history. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just recently read a great essay by Jeff Wall on liquid intelligence, which really, I think, talks about the chemistry of photography, but also just the liquid of the flow, it's being lost, let's say, in digital photography, which is, really interesting in your work of going back to this chemistry. He also kind of references it to the main influence that was of that film of Solaris, for Tarkovsky. Yeah. For me, obviously, it was a massive, when I was cutting this film, it was like, okay, I'm watching The Shining, and I'm watching Solaris, and Stalker. And so it's these three films in my head. I'm kind of looking at the long shot. I'm looking at this, and it's exactly this type of research, right, where the researcher goes to analyze this foreign intelligence, this oceanic intelligence. But really, that oceanic intelligence is analyzing them and throwing back this fantasy space towards them and kind of fucking with that idea of research and who's researching who, which kind of really manifests itself nicely within that kind of short circuit.
Yeah.
So I want to come back to this temporal dimension and especially the issue of science fiction in a few minutes, but to pick up a little bit on what you started to say, Stephanie, there is this aspect in your work. You referred to Robert Smithson. In your work, you're talking about your assignment really as an editorial photographer and sometimes as an architectural photographer, and how you managed to bring that into another zone, actually through a change, recontextualizing it and change in the venue when it comes into the museum or when it comes into the gallery. So Richard, you and I were talking the other day about, and actually we were all talking about, the evolution of photography from something which is really thought of something as a pure form of documentation to becoming more of an art. And I was mentioning to you the Western expeditions in the United States, the geological expeditions that happened in the late 19th century that they first had artists, landscape artists, on site with them, and then they restaged them with Frederick Jackson. He went back and photographed them, and just like you showed with the work, reenacted the expansion of the Western landscape in the United States. And Frederick Jackson then was asked to take those photographs and display them at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, along with becoming the photographer of the exposition itself. So it was in a way of encapsulating this end of the 19th century, the end of the frontier, and another new beginning in this new setting for the Columbian Exposition. So there's a long history of this, in a way, idea of someone being embedded to really capture something, but also being sometimes an agent of propaganda, other times being asked to mythologize, and in the case of Frederick Jackson in the American West, it was really about mythologizing the Western expansion and the closing of the frontier.
Yeah.
And this
I mean,
idea of the
those
landscape.
images were actually used as evidence in front of Congress, as far as
Yeah.
I understand, right? They were taking traditions of landscape painting and that kind of grandeur and using that particular visual logic as a way to make a case for the kind of preciousness and importance of these landscapes. So these pictures, went back into government channels in ways that were quite profound.
Yes, yet the original event was a geological exposition about how to go out and mine resources.
Yeah.
So one, and this is a swerve, but I think it's interesting when you say, Charles, that you talk about your interest in architecture and the lack of foundations for the bunkers, but in fact, the kinds of landscapes you're looking at, the military landscapes, have a very direct relationship to the history of architecture and cities and civilizations, because it really was the military and religious bodies, and to some degree, the state and the market that were before the modern state, the drivers of innovation and the form of settlements. So those techniques of measuring both visible and invisible are the history of architecture.
Definitely.
And even, I don't know if you've ever visited this or whether you photographed it, Richard, one of the first natural history museums was the Oxford Museum, which they wouldn't allow at the university the museum to be put, the whole idea of having natural history was considered blasphemous, right? So the first natural history museum was put in a building that was in the form of a cloister. It was really like a church.
Oh, really? What an interesting contradiction.
And really had to be kind of packaged that way. So I'm wondering about the relationship between the field work and the reassembly of the work in between, let's say, print and the different platforms that you're operating on.
The different platforms are the gallery, the institution that I work with, museums, and the printed page. So I think, for me, it shifts back and forth, and it goes back a little bit to what we were talking about. I'm interested in continuing to work with these publications, but I do have this need, and now I've started to do video and some installation work as well. I do have this need to expand out, and that to me is really important. So that transition from the printed page or the book, books are very important. I'm doing a new book right now. I think they're, one is commodity driven, one actually pays me, and the other one pays me sometimes, the exhibitions. I get grants and things like that to continue my work. But there is this, I would say, symbiotic relationship right now between these two worlds. And it's taken a while. It's taken a while to reach that point where I can feel there's a fluidity back and forth.
But the forensic aspect of your work, which is the first thing that I encountered when I saw it when you did the very large installation on the Palace of the Fine Arts in San Francisco. I don't think for an audience to understand the scale and relationship between, this is a project he did where after an earthquake in California, they had to rebuild this neoclassical building. You would know the building if you watched Vertigo because it's where they are always driving out to. It's this long neoclassical building. So the building was unearthed. Half of it was so above ground and below ground. All the dirt was revealed, and then they found out there was a potter's field.
It was a 19th century burial ground that was the museum was built on top of in the 1920s, and people knew about this. And I was employed by the art museums of San Francisco to do documentary photography. When they found out that there were hundreds of burials beneath the museum got cold feet, and they said, we've got to pull everybody out of this except me. For some reason, they left me in to document it. And I got in trouble with that project. I don't know
I
if you
didn't know that.
this. Yeah, I did. Because I created a book and an exhibition where the museum really wanted no part of it, because there are still burials underneath that museum.
Mm-hmm. And because, sad to say, the burials were not of anyone of Native American or ethnic origin, they were able to just then cover it all over. But your exhibition was incredibly forensic in comparing the scale and the artifacts that were below ground with the artifacts like you showed from the Natural History Museum that were in storage as they were fixing the museum. And I don't think one could have understood what was going on there without the scalar relationships and actually having some photographs were actually presented horizontally as a kind of evidence, and others that were more frontal. That it would have nearly had the kind of impact that it had without it being constructed in space. And your work, Charles, does this a lot too.
Yeah, well, it goes back to something that we were talking about a little bit earlier in relation to, I think it was something that you had said, Charles, a quote from someone that no single photograph. What was it?
Yeah, this was in 1906 in the first International Congress on Photo Documentation, where they wanted to find, what is an archival photograph? What does documentary mean in Marseille? And they literally just said, okay, no photograph was defined as documentary. It was only that a photograph became documentary when it was embedded within an archive, as in within a system itself, which had its ambitions to be a world kind of system of category. So, a very particular definition at that point.
Yeah, and so that's very specific and helpful in relation to thinking about a project like this, where any individual object, any of the individual photographs by themselves might have done something, but you're speaking to the real power of adjacency and interrelation, and the way there's a kind of accumulation of meaning that builds through encountering things in a series. And things in interrelation.
Like in the Natural History Museum.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I've never shown a photograph, partly because I can't make nearly as exquisite photographs of this. It comes out of definitely an amateurism. But there's also this very much fear, this idea of the single image for me, that the work's always shown in a very, complex installation or assortment of how things are playing off each other.
Why are you afraid of the single image?
I'm afraid of the single image because exactly that I'm part of this tradition that's fighting photojournalism, this idea that photojournalism stayed for the last 100 years, that the idea of the snapshot is the idea of the immediacy of the fact and truth. And that hasn't changed. Documentary has changed over the last century to negotiate itself, to talk about truth, And this idea of the studio, of what Roland Barthes would say, the studium, this idea of the difference between truth and fact. And so to have the single image there, I think, proceeds within the idea of photojournalism, and the idea of the documentaries as related to art is something completely different. And it's the idea of the context of that photo that we have the ability, because we don't have to deal with an editor, or these kinds of things, where we can really do our own type of archival system ourselves in that installation space, and therefore hopefully have a little bit more control on how the photograph is not read in a didactic way, perhaps, but at least in a way that is socially or politically activating.
Yeah, so you're pointing... Oh, no, you
So you're concerned about the flattening effect, in a sense, of the photograph, and I think you're also quite interested in because your work started out in sound, in expressing a kind of temporal dimension to all of these places. Or
suspicion of the optics of culture today.
Right.
But can I say something?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, your images feel photographic, very still. I mean, they feel they're very beautiful, I have to say. And I use that in the best sense of the word. There, I was thinking of almost like La Jetée or something when I saw that scene, which is also a science fiction film that was done completely by Chris Marker, of still photographs. So it has some of those qualities. Do you acknowledge that, or do you not?
Oh, definitely. I mean, there's definitely a seduction that needs to happen. You know, I think the image is very utilitarian in that way. The image I use purely as seduction. And, but you know, that's something you have to play with to bring them in. And for me to just make the image leaves me at the threshold of seduction only. And so that's why there has to be, I think, something beyond that for me. I mean, other people have maybe the craft to get beyond that.
And I think it's, you know, part of what you're pointing to is something that, of course, makes my heart glad as someone who is, you know, a museum person, that you're pointing to the way that you can get beyond that threshold of seduction by moving into space and into the space of the exhibition and the particular kind of context that sort of architectural and conceptual frame, you know, that we are coming into a space together where we will encounter an arrangement of things that were put together with purpose, you know, by an artist or by a curator that will allow them to have different kinds of conversations with each other that might be more complex and meaningful and could open up conversations, you know, for the viewer that wouldn't be possible just encountering the thing by itself or the thing moving out in the world detached from other contexts.
But can that installation, that museum setting, can that be equally seductive, though?
Oh, it's completely seductive, and it's a fiction of its own, right? And there are ways that it can be deeply problematic, that it can squash things and kill them, and it can flatten them, you know, every bit as much as, you know, just reducing an image down, you know, just taking the singular image, but it can also be played with, you know. And it creates the museum space at its best. Offers opportunities for really dynamic kinds of conversations between things and people and images, and it's another kind of construct. It's another kind of fiction that can have its own truth as well as its beautiful lies.
Sure. I mean, I think there needs to be a third way, though, between, let's say, the didactic text, which can be played with, and lots of artists do that in a really interesting way. And for me, the idea of the object becomes really important, almost a sense this talisman that you can kind of throw into the space that then creates kind of this idea of energy, you know, that kind of plays with the image. And we talk about fieldwork a lot, and my definition of fieldwork is quite different, I think, than most normal. It's not the ethnographic, or it's not even the scientific aspect of you go out to the field and do field work. The field work for me can be anywhere. It comes out of this more electromagnetic aspect of fields fluctuating and this geopolitics of an idea of an object or a space that is radiating this kind of force that kind of messes with space and your idea of relation to that. And so in that regards, exactly, it can be in the museum or in an institution, or it can be out in the landscape where perhaps no one sees it, you know, bearing a meteorite, you know, in Nunavut, for instance.
So let's stick with that for a moment, because in the beginning of your talk, you had these 2 or 3 turns of phrase, which you talked about the architecture of the invisible and the invisibility of architecture, and then you described, you know, you referred to French theorist, you know, the theory of Berlioz, sort of saying that those bunkers were a kind of last gasp of a certain physicality of military conflict, which is now gone. And in fact, now we have drones and things that don't involve, you know, physical bodies. And in some ways, both in the militaristic view of the world, but also in other kinds of human encounters, things have become less and less physically present or embodied and so your work, you talk about making the invisible visible, and I want to try and make a connection between that and your interest in science fiction,
right?
Because, you know, horror films, the best horror films, which is a different genre, scare people by actually alluding to things which are often not on the not on the screen. You know, it's all about what isn't present, right? Whereas, and I hope I want to get your responses. Of course, science fiction is a genre that is all about manifesting. They're all often projecting to they're often futuristic, but it really is about most often about paranoias of the present, right? Our projection about all of our fears about what's happening now, right? So how's this, is science fiction for you in the way you put these things together, and certainly that vibe with the music and the things, is that for you a way, another form of seduction to get at making things that are invisible visible?
Definitely. I mean, it's there's that whole aspect, Loveland, which I didn't show today, is kind of shot on the same location as some of this work, and it's literally what you don't see in the frame. I think it's like literally behind that, you see a beautiful purple cloud coming across the landscape and overcoming actually the camera, the image itself, so it becomes a purple room. But what you don't see is exactly behind it is the military surveillance station. And for me, though, I mean, I guess my response to that would be, first of all, the science fiction I'm really interested in these like Tarkovsky, where you don't actually see it. You know, the best science fiction also is kind of the same way. It's not techno design. You know, it's not this kind of fetish architecture or this kind of, you know, what is the new gadget. It really is this kind of aspect, as you say, looking and projecting into the future or into an alternate reality exactly the fears, phobias, and fantasies that we have today. And it is kind of that seduction method where you're like, okay, I can use a language that people understand, and they can already enter into it. And you see the landscape in a new way, like Robert Smithson come again, to look at New Jersey and these places, or the Spiral Jetty, and call them Martian landscapes, actually, right? So he's uncomfortable there, but this aspect of going and exactly looking at a landscape with new eyes, that you have to use a trope that's conventional and traditional to see that in an unusual way.
But it's interesting because there's a popular culture aspect to what you're doing as well that you may not even recognize.
Sure.
And that's the movie The Thing.
Oh yeah, John Carpenter is amazing. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that and Dark Star, you know,
Right.
a lot of John Carpenter's work, yeah. I would say not in the editing, but yes, this exact idea. He's brilliant in that way. They live
And like
as well.
Richard said, most of it's taking place off screen. Most of the fear engendered is
Right.
what you think is going to happen.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And
So
then-
Richard, you're not interested in the off-screen. You're interested in what's in front and behind.
I'm interested in what's behind.
Yeah.
I'm interested in what's hidden. What is inaccessible
Yeah.
for the most part.
I want to shift for a little bit, just going from horror to comedy, you know, because it feels like there's a potential kind of comic element in your works that we're not really talking about, but particularly the Civil War pieces. And, you know, it's terrible, but there's also something that's really kind of, you know, funny, particularly about the, you know, the Abe Lincoln pieces and others. But I'm interested in, you know, if you feel like there's humor embedded in the work, and if you want there to be humor embedded in the
Well,
work.
it's coming more to the fore. I mean,
Yeah.
the Abe Lincoln piece was a one-off. I went down there. I thought this would be taken a little more seriously by the people who are participating. And it's like, I looked at them and I said, well, how can you think you possibly look like Abe Lincoln?
They're actually too old.
Well, most of them were.
Yeah, but then that tells you something true about those people, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But I don't know, perhaps it was a joke for them. Perhaps it was
Maybe.
like, hey, I'm just
Yeah.
going to put a top hat on and I'm going to be Abe Lincoln.
But it's linked to the vitrines or the dioramas as well, right? Between two deaths, this idea that Marx says of Hegel that, you know, history repeats itself. You know, first is tragedy, then is comedy.
Right.
And this issue that you look and kind of look at that, there is a humor within this that's happening both within these dioramas of these animals. Obviously, a sad humor in that regard, and with the Civil War photographs, there's kind of that more chuckle, I guess I can say.
I think that, I mean, if there are any reenactors in the audience, I apologize. But I think that it's a really odd culture. And there is an element to humor in what they do. I mean, they're going out on the weekends and recreating this conflagration that happened 150
it's
years ago.
it's part of the culture of heritage. And there's a difference between this idea of heritage, at least this is something I worked on in the United States, the idea of heritage and the idea of history.
How would you describe that?
Heritage is all about inheritance, mythologizing a very particular trajectory in history and elevating it, and it's not about the ambiguities and difficulties of history. So the Civil War reenactments are part of the kind of heritage industry, which drives a lot of tourism, which, when it's done well, can actually open up the right kind of questions about history. But often it's about reinforcing people's sense of their own heritage, their own rather simple place in these histories, and it's a big part of the culture of monument making. that it is constructed around simple stories, right? And repeated over and over again. And if you repeated things, even if they're not true, long enough, people believe they are history, right?
Well, like your photograph, right? Like the photograph, like that staged photograph, the original stage photograph is one of the ones that has circulated. It's in the popular imagination as far as any image is.
But by the way, technically, the original photograph was done in such a way to make that site look so monumental, yet it's a very small...
It's tiny.
It's tiny, and you came closer doing that, but I guess an amateur photographer can't figure that out.
Well, I don't think that's...
that's not the game.
Yeah. I mean, that also goes back to something that we were talking about a little bit earlier around the ways that certain kinds of choices that artists make, particularly artists who are working either in or adjacent to documentary modes, choices about style that start to read as neutral presentation of fact, but are actually highly constructed. I was thinking, so for instance, the low point of view from that original 19th century shot that creates the sense of monumentality. Similarly with your, that there's one great image that you showed us with the bunker tipped over on the beach. It was the image right before the one with the scale shot, but it's a really low camera angle where you really feel, maybe it's just me sitting here in relation to the image, but it really felt like it's looming above you, and that added to a sense of age and kind of ominous something about it. And so those are very particular photographic choices that enhance mood, that shift storytelling, that read as neutral. And we were talking a little bit earlier about Walker Evans, and about classic Hollywood movies of the 30s and 40s, and ways that certain conventions around narrative, visual narrative, start to read as natural and true in ways that then get kind of hard to screw around with.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that photograph is photographed that way, or that shot, because literally, I mean, that's within a narrative of a spaceship crashing into Earth, right? And in that narrative of the science fiction where it's millions of years old. And, the title is The Monument is Ruin. And there is this kind of concept of that in there, of how we talk about that, and what does it mean in these regards. And so exactly something like Walker Evans, which, like we were talking earlier, synthesized the style of neutrality as the document, but yet as a purity of artistic style, he's kind of that pinnacle of that movement, defining it against the Hollywood studio movement. But I mean, yeah, at that point, where do you go, or what happens when you have something like, I'm be curious about the monument to the victims of communism that's being built, right now in Ottawa, and is this heritage or is this history? These kinds of issues. I mean, I know you've done a lot about the monuments and so forth, but it might be taking a little bit out of the direction.
It's an unusual, that's a particularly unusual, monument making has become a very, very contentious political problem, because the more representational, the more explicit the form of something is, the more exclusionary it becomes. And the problem with things, for example, in the United States around 9/11, was they very quickly wanted to make a monument to the victims. And the families were very much involved. In the Civil War, it took 40 years to actually build most of the things.
True.
Right.
So there was a kind of settling and a coming to terms with what had happened, and it wasn't a form of therapy in a sense. Right. Now there's a therapeutic function, but I would say also that in many of these cases, you'll see these monuments taking a very ambiguous, very landscape-based form, because the more representational you try and make them, the more they become politically contentious about who is and isn't represented.
Well, isn't Maya Lin the beginning of that?
Yes,
and
exactly.
Isn't she? It's all about abstraction.
She went right from Richard Serra and Christo to the mall in Washington.
Right.
Yeah, well, that takes me back, maybe this isn't the right thing, but it takes me back a little bit to the idea of camouflage and misdirection also, which is something that we haven't talked about, but also does seem to be something that you're using, both of you, in different ways.
Subterfuge.
Yeah, and there was one of the quotes that you didn't call out from your grandfather's manual that I thought was fantastic, was something like, "Do avoid all straight lines." And I think that's actually great advice for artists. Just the straight path is usually not so interesting.
Well, I would amend that also to say the ambiguous, to celebrate. I mean, that's what I think about in my own work, is that when something's ambiguous and it asks more questions of the audience, then it's working. And I don't know how you feel about that. But.
No, completely. I mean, that's the power of the documentary shifting through its forms, is
Right.
playing with the issue of authority and, let's say, ambiguity versus this immediacy of fact. And
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
that's the boundary that most successful artists have looked at and kind of tried to balance one way or the other, whether it is from Walker Evans to, the photoconceptualism, like we were talking earlier,
Right.
of Smithson, Robert Long, Bruce Nauman, and then Ed Ruscha, as you brought up. This idea of photoconceptualism being like, okay, the parody of photojournalism, and the kind of end game that goes. But there's that ambiguity that needs to always kind of shift between those, whether it is parody or stepping back, as you say, with your craft and showing kind of the context that's happening within the image itself.
Reviewing the apparatus.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's most striking, well, in your installations, because they're very apparatus-based, and then, of course, particularly with the animal logic things, the sort of unmasking of the, literally, of the sort of what the archive is, what's on display, what the elements of display are. So I could really go on, I have to say, on this subject for a very long time. We do have an official schedule, and I'm thinking maybe it might be interesting to take a few questions from the audience.
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
This is a question for Charles. I'm really curious about the idea of hiding the method that the coniferous ether was made in the actual film, but when it's shown in gallery, you actually do reveal the mechanism which displays the film. So it's kind of several reversals there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's actually kind of a great question, because it was going to be my response to Richard before I ran out of time. So, like I was saying, I don't have the craft of an image maker, I think, like Richard's brilliant photographs. And I exactly design installations this way. And this piece I love very much. And unfortunately, I can only show it in certain contexts, because it is a 35 millimeter film. But it's very much, I have to show it on film, partly because I'm not allowed to show you a lot of the images. I had to smuggle them out, actually, of the station. So I don't have them on digital form, so I only release them kind of in the old studio, keep things, from piracy on 35 millimeter film. But there's an issue that has to be shown on film. The image I showed here was just kind of more of a home issue. I showed it here for Nuit Blanche in downtown, so the projector's in the room. But normally, you have to experience this piece by walking into an antechamber first, and you just see the projector running. And then once you see the projector running, you enter actually the projection space. And for me, that's really important, because you need to see the mechanism building the fantasy space. Because science fiction is a fantasy, and it gets you places, and obviously our fantasies teach us how to desire. They are that projection screen of desire. And so it's important, however, to see that machine running to realize that that projection of fantasy has a material presence. And in particular, this case with the Arctic, where I lived for 5 years, there was always the great new idea of like, let's do new technology. Let's fly drones for surveillance to help hunters, or these kind of ridiculous ideas of like open source and so forth. But really in this climate, what you need is something that works, is robust, and you can fix on site. And so this idea of the mechanical projector running when there's an image of a power station that runs this thing off grid, you have this connection between the material apparatus that projects it along with the image that you're looking at. And that's really important as an apparatus to understand what's going on. Otherwise, it's just the department coming and being very happy that I made this film, and they can't wait for me to work with them again, not realizing, oh, actually there's a critique of military colonialism going on here underneath everything.
Yeah, and it seems like that's also, there's a way that having that kind of sequencing, and there's an almost ceremonial or kind of ritual kind of, thing that you're starting to encourage somebody to embody as they move through. It feels like there's a little bit of that's connecting, maybe in a loose way, but connecting the viewer back to the kinds of embodied research that you're describing doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Very short question for Richard, and a slightly less short one for Charles.
Richard Barnes.
Yeah, that's right. The Unabomber cabin, it's interesting that you withheld the interior. That's where he lived. We are not allowed in, and that, to me, is where I want to be. And my question to Charles is very interesting that you just brought it up a second time, is that when you edit your films, you think of Tarkovsky or great craftsmen like Kubrick, and yet when you're confronted with the photography, you fall back into a kind of conscious de-skilling, as if photography at this stage was incredibly difficult and arcane. And I'm wondering if it's not part of a long history of distrust of photography from the very early painters who were scared of its capacity to depict. And then, in the minimalists, someone like Gordon Matta Clark was looked down upon by his minimalist peers because he was too good a photographer. So I'm wondering if that's
loves Gordon Matta Clark.
We all do, but you know what I'm saying? It's about the status of the medium.
The interior. Believe me, if I had had access to the interior, I would have done it. It wasn't a conscious decision not to do it. The lawyer was hovering over me saying, you cannot, for some reason, you cannot photograph the interior. It's interesting you should ask that, though, because 5 years after I photographed the images I showed you here, the cabin was still in situ in the warehouse, and People magazine, of all places, called me and said, would you be interested in going back and photographing the interior of the cabin? And I thought, I can't pass this up, I'm gonna do it. But it had been totally eviscerated. Yeah, it was.
But you saw it when you were able to see it when you.
I saw it, I could look through the windows.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But there's something, I find that really interesting, because we were talking earlier about that, and that issue of privacy, and, does Kaczynski lose his right to privacy and to have his personal, it's one thing to be, forensically analyzed, and then it's another thing to slip and do this linguistic slip where you go from like the exhibit, right, the legal to literally Latin, to hold out and to exhibit, to then go to the exhibit in a museum for spectacle, shall we say, and have that privacy put on display, and the interior of that cabin and so forth. I find that, a very tricky, problematic.
Kaczynski was completely taken apart in not only the New York Times article, but several others about how he was subject to psychological testing as a student. I mean, the whole
by the CIA, exactly, unethical.
But also he's in deep six right now. He loses all of his rights by American standards anyway.
Right.
So it's free game. It's interesting. Just one last thing. I don't want to turn this into a conversation about Ted Kaczynski, but I'm now dealing with a person who has acquired many of his artifacts, the red sweatshirt. He wants me to come back in and do this project with him based around the other artifacts that were auctioned off by the government.
Yeah.
So I want to point out the fact that you did not answer the question about photographs, and it's making me, think about the fact that you've spent time, with folks in military intelligence, and we're talking about camouflage, and it's making me want to go back and look at the photographs, because maybe, in fact, they are the most important part of your work, and you're deploying classic misdirection.
One more question. All great artists do that.
And the best artists make you think up the photo in your head. You don't have to take it.
It's operated by a drone above the...
Yeah. My question sort of directed to all of you about making the invisible visible. You talk about a good example being, say, the use of science fiction to allude to that which we say we might have lost touch with. So, through abstraction, we no longer have a immediate sense of our world. So you use, say, the medium of science fiction and the image to make a closer connection with that which we can no longer see, that which is no longer visible. And I'm wondering if maybe you could speak more to, say, architecture and design, and how, have you seen any examples, or do you have any thoughts on the trajectory of how perhaps, rather than the image, but actual architectural design could do the same thing? I mean, that's a lot.
Richard?
Well, I think just as I was saying in the beginning from Cornelia Oberlander, as an architect, you have to be able to go and understand and look at whether it's the city or some variation on broad conditions of urbanization or the country, actually understand very carefully where you're operating and what the circumstances are or where the capacity is to actually locate, summon, make architecture there. I do think that there's a whole genre, for example, of Richard's work on the more commercial side, but not quite, that he hasn't shown. That's quite interesting. He was the sort of on-call photographer for Nest magazine. How many of you know Nest magazine? So Nest magazine is like an outlier in the explosion of shelter magazines. We all know, what do they call it? What are some of them?
Shelter magazine.
Yeah, which are lifestyle, which are the popular manifestation of architecture for many people in the public who are obsessed with mid-century design and all of these things. Nest, which was published for how many years?
6.
Was a little bit like the, do you know the show Cops? It was this show on television, may still be on, where they followed police around and they would they would follow police around and they go to usually people of a lower socioeconomic scale that were being arrested, and they're always dithering out their faces, but you got to see the inside of houses of where people really live. Very rare on television. And Nest, in its own weird way, went to these kind of extreme interiors and life, sometimes historic, right, but also in contemporary, and showing people who were on the outer edges of architecture and craft and so it was interesting in that way because it broke away from the kind of middle common denominator mindset that has been reinforced by the kind of taste culture of architecture. And for that sense was a really important, for me, piece of work. I mean,
and me too. It allowed me to fully go into. One of my assignments was to photograph the Greenbrier Hotel. Do you know about the Greenbrier? And the Greenbrier Hotel was covered by Nest. It was the Greenbrier Hotel, and I think it's in West Virginia, and it's this wonderful Southern Belle building, Belle Epoque. It's beautiful. But underneath the Greenbrier was the alternative government site in case of nuclear war. And it was a secret.
Where people from Washington would go.
Yeah, from Washington. Yeah. And they had to get there first, and that's the real problem, was that it was about 200 miles away. But it was fascinating that this hotel was built there, and for decades nobody knew this. I mean, nobody in the public knew it. And those were the kind of assignments that Nest did. Now, I don't know if this addresses your question necessarily.
Well, are you at the architecture school? Yeah. Okay, so we have an exhibition up by one of our recent graduates, Ting Chak, which based on her thesis project, where she documented all the spaces of detainment around issues of citizenship and immigration in Canada, and these are things that are unseen.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of examples.
Yeah.
I mean, just to throw two into the mix, Trevor Paglin is an American artist who's been doing a number of interesting projects dealing with different kinds of invisibility around American military operations, which is going to be a theme tonight maybe, but one of them has involved trying to track down CIA safe houses, for instance, and document them, or different kinds of CIA spaces that are in what look like completely nondescript buildings, but actually have all kinds of stuff going on inside. Mm-hmm. Or somebody like Michael Rakowitz, who is an artist based in Chicago, who's done a lot of projects, or a whole series of projects that have dealt with providing temporary shelter for individual homeless people, collaborating with them to create these temporary inflatable shelters that attach to the sides of buildings and inflate. And he had these really interesting conversations with these guys when he first started working with them. So it takes, the tent it takes waste heat that's being vented from a building, channels it down into basically this kind of inflatable tent pod. And first was talking with them about the possibility of using black, those big black kind of Hefty bags. I don't know if Hefty is a brand that crosses the states. Close enough, right? And really sturdy, really cheap. And in conversations with these guys, they said, actually, no, we're invisible enough already that if we have these structures made out of this particular material, that just kind of perpetuates our invisibility, our marginalization. And so they developed, they used white and they used clear. And so they have this really beautiful, vivid, sculptural presence when they're used as temporary interventions. So they're both actual shelter and a temporary moment where something that is invisible and at the margins is given visible space and kind of temporarily monumentalized.
So if you come and you see this project that our student did, I mean, there is an optimistic aspect to depicting these things, some of which are a little bit scary, which is by drawing them, by revealing these places that people don't see, one would hope that by drawing attention to that we will begin to improve those conditions and bring our architectural skills to bear on making those environments at least more humane.
Yeah.
So that's my long, rambling answer to that. I think we should probably wrap up. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I want to especially thank our guest, Stephanie Smith, Richard Barnes, Stankievech.